So this week's The World Today will examine the first year of Russia's latest invasion of Ukraine and prospects for the future. The war has raised many questions, including about what many have called an existential crisis for liberal democracies and rule-based systems, the efficacy of the United Nations, the expansion and reach of NATO, a realigned global order, the prospect of more war and perhaps the use of nuclear weapons, and how in the end this conflict may end. You're in for a very rich discussion, a rich analysis of what's happening today and prospects for the future. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce our four panelists, or three panelists and a moderator. There's been one change I'll let you know about. Robin Dunnigan is the Deputy Assistant Secretary responsible for Central and Eastern Europe in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs in the State Department. She previously served as the Charge d'Affaires and Deputy Chief of Mission of the U.S. Embassy in Austria from 2018 to 2021, a career member of the Senior Foreign Service with the rank of Minister Counselor. Deputy Assistant Secretary Dunnigan joined the State Department in 1992. Our second panelist, Maria Sevgovaya, is a senior fellow with the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a postdoctoral fellow in Georgetown University's Wall School of Foreign Service. We do not hold that against her, and a fellow at the Illiberalism Studies program at George Washington University. Brigadier General Peter Beeswax, retired, a visiting fellow at Perry Roldhaus, served as the U.S. Senior Defense Official and Attaché to the Russian Federation from 2012 to 2014, a period which included Russia's first invasion of Ukraine. He also served in West Germany, Kosovo, South Korea, and Afghanistan. Last but not least, the program says that John Gans will be moderating, but he came down with an emergency. And instead, we have the inimitable Trudy Rubin, who is a fellow with Perry Roldhaus and also happens to be the worldview columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Before joining the Inquirer in 1993, she was Middle East correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor and previously was a national correspondent for the Monitor and a staff writer for The Economist. She has received numerous prizes throughout her career. From 2001 to 2017, she was a finalist, in 2001 and 2017, she was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for commentary. She is the author of Willful Blindness, the Bush Administration and Iraq. It gives me great pleasure to welcome them to the stage.
Just want to make sure this is on. Okay, it seems to be working. It's a pleasure to have you here. I want to reiterate that we hope you will all line up for questions when the discussion is over. As you know, the 24th was the anniversary of this war, and it's a war that nobody really wants to celebrate. Not even Vladimir Putin, who started it and isn't doing so well. But it's important, I think, to both look at where we are and to look forward as to where the panelists think we might be a year from now, to look at what winning means, what losing means for both sides. So without waiting further, I'm going to ask the panelists to give short remarks on where they think the situation stands now with the war, with Putin's war. And after that, we will have a discussion amongst us for about 20 minutes, and then we will turn to the audience for questions. So let me start first with Robin Dunnigan. How would you describe where things stand now, Robin?
Thank you very much. And thanks to Perry House for hosting me. It's wonderful to be here. I love this campus. I would note 5 things sort of 1 year in of where we are. The first is Ukrainian resolve. I think the world has been humbled really by Ukraine's courage and resilience and willingness to fight for its freedom. And I think President Putin vastly underestimated what that resolve would mean for his war against Ukraine. The second thing I would note is U.S. resolve. You all saw that President Biden was in Kyiv last week, and he repeated what he has said repeatedly over the last year, which is the United States will stand with Ukraine as long as it takes. And the resolve, when I talk about U.S. resolve, it's also the resolve of the American people and the U.S. Congress. There is still extremely strong bipartisan support in Congress, and I think they get that because their constituents strongly support U.S. assistance to help Ukraine. We have thus far given about $50 billion of security, economic, and humanitarian assistance to support Ukraine. The third thing I would note is the unity of the coalition that's supporting Ukraine. And here is where I really do have to credit President Biden, because building this coalition started long before this war started. When President Biden came into office, he said in his instructions to us who worked in his administration were, we need to rebuild and repair our alliances and our partnerships in Europe because we cannot tackle the world's challenges without these partners. So before we even started talking about the war in Ukraine, we were doing that. As soon as we got intelligence that Russia was planning this war in October, November of 2021, the president instructed us to declassify that intelligence as soon as possible and share it with our allies, because he knew that we needed our allies to meet this challenge. And in fact, that's what's happened. We have painstakingly built a strong coalition of countries, about 50 countries that are supporting Ukraine with similar kinds of assistance that we are and are implementing sanctions. The fourth thing I would note 1 year in is that Russia is paying a price. Russia has lost battles in Kyiv and Kherson and Kharkiv across Ukraine. The United Nations has voted overwhelmingly against what Russia is doing. Russia is experiencing the largest set of sanctions against an economy of its size ever. You need people, capital, effective use of resources, and innovation to grow your economy. And Russia is losing all of those things day by day. Our chief economist in the State Department told me, even if everything goes perfectly for Russia right now from here on out, it won't get to where its GDP was a year ago until 2030. The fifth and final thing I would note is a 1 year in is I don't think any of us could have imagined the scale of the atrocities that Russia is committing in Ukraine. They're leveling maternity hospitals, they're leveling schools with children in them. They are leaving towns where they've murdered, tortured, raped. They're deporting children and re-educating them in Russia. It's the scale of the atrocities, I think in 2023 is unimaginable, and there will have to be accountability. And we can talk later about where we go forward. I'll just stop there 1 year in.
Thanks very much. Peter, would you like to do the same? Where are we now?
A real pleasure to be in front of you today. Here we are, just a few days after the 24th of February, which has now become a date sort of seared into consciousness. 1 year after the Russian unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, the second one since the end of the Cold War. And when you look at where we are and where we were a year ago, think about Europe, Russia. We had some assumptions, that the Russians' military was, not 10 feet tall, but certainly 8 feet tall and formidable after successes in Crimea and in sort of kind of Eastern Ukraine and also in Syria. But we and they were arrayed, and there was all this, if you remember, all this sort of parsing out the tea leaves. Are they going to go or are they not? I think conventional wisdom was that in the end they wouldn't, and they did. And then we saw an absolutely extraordinary turn of fate where a year later, the vaunted, not so vaunted, but very, very dangerous Russian war machine could not seize, if you will, a territorial trophy, if you will, like Bakhmut that you've all read about for the 24th, just a few days ago. And so their military, their doctrine, their approach, again, assumptions. I think a lot of us thought that they weren't bad, and in some cases pretty good, but were rather almost stunned how inept that is and how that has driven driven the operation, and also I think created unbelievable, though difficult fully to discern, stressors and cracks and fissures inside the Russian Federation, and I believe also inside of the Kremlin. On the other side, and Robin had mentioned it, we have seen NATO. You've seen sort of a new respect, even more modern Ukraine born, and an unbelievable moxie and will to fight and national pride that has infected much of the free-minded world. And in that, you had an unproven leader born of almost Churchillian effect, though he looks like the Churchill, and the man probably most in the world, Vladimir Putin, who really is the driver, who, if there's any single person in the world he sees about more, it's Zelensky. So we've seen NATO not reborn, but reaffirmed. Sweden and Finland want in. You've seen a different Europe. You've just seen in the last 10 days, a remarkable period of events. And getting at the prior points, you had the Munich conference where laws, crimes against humanity were made. You had then President Biden make an extraordinary, daring visit to Kyiv, and then goes back to a near hero's return in Warsaw, in Warsaw, which is just all of it's just pulling the alliance together. You had the Putin speech at the Duma, to the Twin House, where he rails against the West and suspends New START. So there's a lot that's going on in this week that goes back to that. And just a few more points. The Chinese foreign minister visits just a few days ago, and now talk about what will be the Chinese role, and Putin and Xi Jinping possibly meeting. You have the General Assembly meeting that just occurred. And so it is now, this is a war, Russia, Ukraine, but this is a global issue now, and we'll see how that goes. And again, alliance cohesion is critical, and I'll stop here. There's so much to go on, and also the whole, you've all just learned in the last year, a whole new lexicon in arms and weapons and all that, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. But really the unprecedented support, but carefully measured, that we and our allies have provided Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry to go last, since in the typical Russian novel fashion, I'll add a grain of salt to the celebratory panelists before me. So while I definitely concur that Ukraine and the Western unity deserve a lot of credit in this war, unfortunately, things are not as bright from my perspective 1 year into this war as we would ideally like them to be. First of all, a lot of revision that's been going on last year, challenging our assumptions about essentially how we used to think about the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union did not collapse peacefully, as we come to realize, right? In fact, it's still collapsing 30 years later. And this bloodbath that is unraveling in front of our eyes, essentially this continued end of the empire, or ending of the empire. So similarly, the Cold War really has never ended. There was just an interim period in the 1990s, again, as we come to understand, but the Russian elites who largely held on to power in Russia, unfortunately, largely preserved the same Cold War sort of outlook towards things, which contributed to this tragedy. Now, will the empire end? That's the question that we all kind of will be answering in the next years. And unfortunately, this year has shown that the answer is not necessarily positive. While the US administration has done a lot and deserves a lot of credit on these stages during this war, at the same time, things are not as bad as for Russia as we'd like them to be ideally. Sanctions bite, for example, and CSIS, for example, has done a lot of studies recently showing that, yes, it will be harder for Putin to fight this war socially, economically and militarily, but he still will be able to for a while, despite this pressure that's imposed on him. Similarly, the society in Russia unfortunately shows remarkable degree of complacency and conformism, which probably will also give me a green light. And while Russian military is problematic and has shown itself being quite weak, it still is able to fight and create a lot of costs for Ukraine. So the major question I'd like us to answer is honestly, in a lot of ways, the answer depends on how the West envisions the victory of Ukraine. And unfortunately, when I talk to the US policymakers, the answer I always get is, well, Ukraine has to decide. But Ukraine has already decided Ukraine wants its territory back. The question is, will the West sustain its support needed for Ukraine to be able to do so, right? I'm really hoping that the answer is positive. So far, unfortunately, I'm not convinced.
Well, Maria has brought us just to the point that I wanted to raise with Robin. The definition for what the United States wanted for Ukraine after Russia attacked a year ago has changed over the last year. When I was in Ukraine for the 2 weeks just prior to the war, while the US was very clear and very correct that the Russians would attack, the Ukrainians were not convinced. The outcome that the US expected was a quick Russian takeover of government in Kyiv, and the US was thinking of training Ukrainians to resist. I was in Ukraine in July, and then the US delivered HIMARS, and it seemed like the Ukrainians then could take back territory and went on a roll. Now President Biden uses the word victory, but what I want to ask, Robin, is what is victory in the United States point of view? How is it defined? And when the US says they want to help Ukraine get to the point where they can bring Putin to the table, is there any clear idea of this? Does anyone in the US government really think that Putin would bargain? Or is the US conception that he would only come to the table after Ukraine had taken back most of its territory? So what does victory mean? And what does negotiations mean?
Thank you. And they're all very good points. I will start with that only Ukraine can define for itself what victory means, because I know we say it, but we say it because we mean it. Zelensky is a democratically elected president. He has a population that cares deeply about what the outcome of this war looks like. And it's not for us to decide. It is really for Ukrainians to decide. And ultimately, what that peace looks like only can be decided by Ukrainians and what's acceptable for Ukrainians. How do you get Putin to the negotiating table? The truth is, Zelensky has said this, that this is only going to end with negotiations. That's how wars end, right? But Putin has shown no interest in negotiating, zero. So how do you get him to that point? And yes, I think that Ukraine has to continue to be winning on the battlefield and have leverage on the battlefield. And Russia has to continue to feel the pain of sanctions and the squeeze of sanctions to get to that point. What's the exact right mix? We don't know. I can't get inside Putin's head, but as long as Ukraine is pushing, gaining back territory, which it has since its original loss after February 24th. I will say that we talk a lot about a just and durable peace, and I'm often asked by what the United States means by that. But I think that there's sort of global agreement on some core elements of a just and durable peace. In this case, a just peace means that that Russia does not get to keep the territory that it has taken by force, that goes against the principles that Russia itself has signed on to as a member of the UN, as a member of the UN Security Council. What Putin has said is, sure, I'll negotiate as long as Ukraine accepts the territorial realities as they are today. That is not a just peace, nor is it durable, nor is it good for the rest of the world that sees that it's okay, any other would-be aggressors, that it's okay to take territory by force. And durable means that Russia can't come back and do it again in 3 months or 6 months or 2 years, because that isn't only not good for Ukraine, it's not good for any of us. So our strategy is that we continue to give Ukraine leverage by helping it win on the battlefield and keeping the pressure on Putin, economic pressure and international global pressure.
Peter, just to follow up on that point, you're a military man. You served in military intelligence. Are you with the military attaché, sorry, in Russia at a critical period up to 2014 when the Russians invaded for the first time into Donbass. Can you illuminate for us what was Putin's goal as the US saw it and as you saw it in 2014? And what is his goal now? What is victory? What does victory mean for Putin?
Okay, how to do this in a minute. I think that Putin already regarding Ukraine, and I think he believes that whatever Russia's legacy and his own personal legacy, that he's clinically obsessed that that Ukraine is going to be part of that. That Ukraine is traditionally always been part of Russia, and Ukrainians obviously push back on that. He, I think, with this now in 2014, the Russians had seen the Orange Revolution, but I arrived at the end of 2012, and the Russians had just gone through major protests called the Bolotnaya protests and all that, and so there were issues inside. But Maidan, which is occurring, you know, that November to January, I think really sears its way into the Russian psyche, especially as Yanukovych flees. And I think in that period, they make a determination, it's already been there on the books, that we're going to do something about Ukraine. And during, as we remember, the Sochi Olympics is just comes up, and a number of us think that at that time they went into a final planning session that, okay, we're going in after Sochi and we're going to do, and did actually, very skillful stealth invasion and of Crimea. And then they illegally annexed that in March. Then they take the formula and fail. It's ugly. They don't lose, but they don't succeed. In the Donbass, where they're fighting with proxies, but Russian regulars are there. And then you take all of that and you see where they do have success in Syria in 2015. All these things, the aggregate, as the Russians exercise combat, the full stretch of their non-nuclear capability, the little green men to flying strategic bombers to support Syria. You take that today, and now, and there, you know, 2008 and discussions about possibly a membership action plan for Ukraine and Georgia. So the Russians are on edge, and they are taking advantage of, they're feeling their oats, and they, and I think all of this leads, we're going to take care of Ukraine once for all. We've got this NATO talk going on. And the arrogance and the disdain, how they viewed Ukraine and their military somewhat, though the military did put up a fight, led to their really abysmal planning effort, their overestimation of their own capabilities. You've got a lot of corruption, and they're training a lot of these big Cecil B. DeMille training things, but really they haven't practiced frontal operations 600 miles since they fought in the Second World War. So they weren't ready, and then they understaffed it with the force, and now they have the fiasco that they have, and they have been working out of it. And that's where there is urgency on the weapons and training, and where we are now. Last thing is, again, the Russians, we thought were in an offensive, beginning of which around Bakhmut in the central, and the Ukrainians stood stood up to them, but it is an ugly, grinding, attritional Verdun. Ukrainians don't want that. They want to be nimble. They want to counterattack, and we don't want that for them either.
Could I just jump in Putin's support quickly? One thing I think Putin got it right, and I think one of the reasons why he decided to invade was the actual perception of relative decline of Russia as opposed to Ukraine, in particular militarily, as Ukraine military was getting training and weapons from Ukraine over these years, right? And looking at what's going on the battlefield, honestly, can you say he was wrong? Russia can hardly manage Ukraine as is, of course, with all the Western support, but they failed originally to achieve their military goals, partly because Ukraine's courage and military preparation, right? So honestly, looking from this perspective, Putin was not exactly wrong, as he was saying that Ukraine was becoming, in his terms, quote unquote, anti-Russia, growing increasingly stronger, and again, is in his terms, more dangerous for Ukraine. So I think there was some rationale, even if all of that, of course, turned out catastrophically.
So Maria, to pick up from there, many commentators are saying that Putin still thinks he can win. So can you describe to us, if you think that's a correct analysis, what does winning mean at this point, 1 year on, for Vladimir Putin?
That's an excellent, and I think it's a crucial question, honestly, for this conversation. A lot of observers, I see, were a little bit too fast to announce Putin's failure in Ukraine. I agree that Putin did not win in Ukraine, but he also did not lose. And I think this is crucial because, of course, there's a contingency planning in military, right? If you don't achieve your original goals, you usually have plan B. And it's true that Russia failed abysmally with this original Blitzkrieg plan. But unfortunately, Russia is way too strong and has too many resources to be able to continue inflicting consistent damage on Ukraine. And I think this is how Putin would define victory, if we were to ask him honestly at this point, right? Peter referenced his Putin's last week's address, federal address, in which essentially the key message that comes across is, yeah, we're here in the long haul, get ready, deal with it. And pretty much this attitude, if you look at the Russian officials, you know, they may be not particularly happy about the way they're doing on the front line, but they're not really horrified or too anxious about it either. They're managing, and this is the key problem that I wanted to get back to, that Russian officials and the Kremlin itself is far from believing that they're failing in Ukraine. And unfortunately, they still have reasons to believe that, right? The economy has not collapsed. The population society is largely conformist. I was mentioning that. And the military is learning. I would recommend Dara Masikat, one of the best military analysts, a recent article in Foreign Affairs, where he actually shows how Russian military on the ground learns from the past mistakes. So yes, maybe they will not be able to occupy half of Ukraine, but they might as well be able to hold on to at least a part of the territory that they so far have invaded. They also have enough capacity to keep producing missiles, even if those are not going to be as smart, as high-tech, worse quality, but nonetheless still inflict a lot of damage on Ukraine. And for Ukraine, which has lost about 1/3 of its GDP, as opposed to Russia, which lost like 3% of its GDP last year, it's going to be highly problematic in the future because, of course, investment won't come, right? And all these other potential troubles will ensure that that will sustain Ukraine in this very difficult state. This is exactly what we want to avoid, right? And this is why, once again, I call for all of us to define exactly what it means for Ukraine to win. Thank you.
So let me ask you all one final question. And if we can start with Robin, and it really follows up on the discussion we've had. If Putin considers it to be a victory to have Ukraine destroyed and in a stalemate, that's what you're saying. Nobody's going to invest in Ukraine. It's not going to get rebuilt. The Black Sea will still be controlled by Russia. No exports. In a sense, a landlocked basket case. That's a victory. Do you think that Ukraine can withstand a stalemate for another year? And if not, or even if yes, is the West giving Ukraine the weapons it needs for a victory or only sufficient weapons for a stalemate? And let me start from Maria and we'll work our way back.
So what, in other words, what does Ukraine need to win?
I'm sorry.
So just to formulate the question.
So the question is, can Ukraine withstand a stalemate for another year? And is the West giving Ukraine the weapons to win? And by winning, meaning the Ukrainian definition, drive the Russians out, or just enough weapons for a stalemate?
Quickly, first of all, the Western support for Ukraine has been completely unprecedented, not just for the recent years, but for pretty much all of the history in the West and the United States in particular deserve enormous credit. Having said that, unfortunately, it's still not enough based on our understanding. We actually know the Russian situation on the ground much better than we know of the Ukrainian military situation. That's for the good reason. It's a war, so we don't want to disclose all the information publicly available to Russians. But based on our understanding, right, there is a lot of problems with the manpower in Ukraine. And of course, the weapons that are being supplied, they are important, but they're not enough. They are not supplied quickly enough, and there's not enough of them to be able to drive the Russians away. Russians in the same way do suffer some problems in terms of their defense industry. We're actually working on a big report in that regard, but they're able, as I said, to substitute what they're losing on the ground with inferior quality, but nonetheless working maybe sort of Second World War time period weapons that still create problems in Ukraine just because of the effect of the size. So a lot has been done, even more, unfortunately, should be done.
Peter, if you could pick up there.
A grinding attritional battle is certainly going to be extremely challenging for Ukraine. But what I've seen in many of us is the sheer will and moxie of the Ukrainians, their sense of identity that the Russians completely miscalculated. The atrocities that have occurred that is going to make reconciliation, whatever happens, impossible for the next generation or two. They'll stay and hang and get and hang together as long as I think they don't feel abandoned. And I think that the aspects of the viciousness of the Russian campaign that continues really does work against the Kremlin in the global court. And when we look at what's going on the front, it's awful. But then let's talk a little bit about the internals to Russia. This is not a popular war. Bad news just doesn't go down; it goes up from the field. This is something, and if the Russians continue this, they are going to be taking a lot of losses, and they are increasingly going to have to pull from mainstream Russian society, where they've now been pulling heavily from the periphery. So time doesn't work in many cases for both countries. And I think that the longer this goes for the Russians, a little bit like World War I, where everything collapses for the Russians in 1916 after interminable losses on the front. So I think that Putin is under pressure and the regime is under pressure internally. Was the Russian mothers that came out during Afghanistan at the end to kind of get things going. We've seen the hundreds of thousands of young able-bodied leave. And so a long war doesn't necessarily mean that the Russians can sustain it either. Plus, you've got Game of Thrones potentially going on within the Kremlin and the intelligence apparat and the generals and Yevgeny Prigozhin and these groups, these paramilitary groups. So there's a lot that could go wrong for Putin and Russia. And I think in the next year, we're talking in a 1-year perspective, as we saw in the last year, I think we're going to have to expect the unexpected, and there will be black swans that go that we have not yet anticipated, and really positive things as well. But this is hard. This a Verdun type fight is hard as long as we're supporting. And again, the black versus white aspect of it, I think will matter. And we're just going to have to see.
And Robin, in answering this question, let me rephrase it. Do you foresee in the near term, spring, summer, that the West, that includes Europe as well as the United States, will be looking to break a stalemate and provide more of the weapons and systems that Ukraine says it needs to make a breakthrough towards victory?
So going back to Maria's point, I think both things can be true. One is that we're doing a lot, not just us, but this coalition of 50 countries, we're doing a lot, and we're all going to need to do more. So I think both can be true. And so over the course of the next year, I think you'll see us doing more, and we are working really hard. We are leading that coalition of, not just the West, there are G7 countries as well that are providing this security assistance. So that's true. Can Ukraine withstand it? Absolutely. I was in Kyiv in December when Russia really started hitting the energy infrastructure. It was cold, it was freezing. It's cold in Kyiv in December. And, government offices had the lights off. People were working with their, parkas on, and we were going down, to basements when the air sirens were going off. Every Ukrainian who I met said, this is not going to stop us. They can't freeze us out of, they can't freeze us to make us give up. So I just think, I've said it before, but I'll say it again. I think that we cannot underestimate the resilience of a people that are fighting for their right to exist. And I think that consistently underestimating Ukrainians has been a downfall for Russians. And then last but not least, sort of what can Ukraine withstand it if it doesn't have access, if it doesn't have a functioning economy? And, that goes back to a durable and just peace. And Ukraine's going to have access to its ports, to its agricultural heartland, to the bridges that export its goods. It's going to have those things to exist, and needs its people to come home to work. 8 million Ukrainians are living outside of Ukraine right now since the war started. Those guys got to come home and work again. And so those are all the conditions for peace that I think President Zelensky will need to see.
Thanks very much. Now, if you have a question to ask, the microphone is over here. So please line up, and we will also be getting questions from the online audience. Tom, do you want to start with one from the onliners?
This is from Zoom. How will China react to the U.S. NATO pounding of Russia and its efforts to take Ukrainian territory? And this is in the context of China's desire to control Taiwan.
Which one of you would like to?
Of the question, because I think it's a really important premise. The U.S. and NATO are not pounding Russia. The U.S. did not attack Russia. NATO did not attack Russia. Ukraine did not attack Russia. Russia is the aggressor here. And there is a world, and Russia loves this, when this battle is cast as a fight between Russia and NATO, and it is not. NATO is a defensive alliance and has never set out to attack Russia. So I'll let others answer the rest of the question, but I want to just take issue with the premise.
Just very, very quickly, China. Remember, Vladimir Putin was in China for the Beijing Olympics just several weeks before, and the majority will think that he told Xi Jinping they probably were going to go, probably no operational details, and Xi Jinping probably responded sort of, okay, we'll support you, not necessarily militarily, but don't get into trouble. And what has happened is that Russia, and I'm coming back to Taiwan, Russia invaded and completely botched the operation. And not just botched it militarily, but botched it politically to the point where the invasion coalesced not just NATO and the EU, but much of the free-minded world, including countries in the Pacific. And so if I'm Xi Jinping, entertaining ambitions regarding the Pacific and Taiwan, I'm furious, actually, quietly, because the Russians have now pulled together. It's complicated, the world, and is also now given the Taiwanese hope and some operational lessons learned from the Ukrainians that would make such an endeavor much harder.
Next question.
Thank you. I was just wondering, how many people, as far as military, are involved in the actual, conflict between, what is the amount of people on the Ukrainian side and the Russian as far as military, but also, on the media, you always see the aftermath, basically, of the battles. You'll see a stagnant trench or whatever. How many people are actually dead for this conflict, and what are the casualties? I would like to know about the dead first and the casualties together. And if you if you have an idea that it's going to be like a World War I Verdun situation, that's a very important thing to know, I think.
Anybody, Peter?
All estimates, and it depending who you're talking to. You hear it from the Ukrainians, you hear it from the British, do very good work, and you hear it from the Russians, who downplay everything. The going numbers out there, and they're in my mind, with a margin of error by the tens of thousands. As you've heard now, numbers in the range of casualties to the Russians between 150 and 200,000. And estimates, you always, 3 to 4 times more wounded than dead. 60,000 is the number in that range. So that's there, and that is a toll, and that doesn't play well in Mother Russia, even out in the peripheral regions where you saw in Dagestan, they went out on the streets, and in Buryatia. Ukraine, it's grievous too. Their military is approximately right now 400,000 mobilized and all that, but they have a civil defense home guard of millions of able-bodied. And the Russians not only are on the front with maybe 1/3 they think, in Ukraine, including police and all that, but the Russians now they're fighting a partisan war as well. They're up on the front, and it sounds, but they have probably 60, 70,000 with their proxies in Donetsk, having to guard their supply route. So this is a hard operation. Russians are taking losses. And when the soldiers do go back and the word gets to more conscripts or people coming in, the word is, this is a really lousy place. And I think over time that will erode the Russian military. Certainly there's almost no will, though getting at your point, they are better. They are learning. They're learning as you do to survive in a conflict like this.
Can I just quickly add on the Russian regional situation? Things are not as dire in Russia, sorry, Peter. As a matter of fact, if you look at the data, statistically, Russian poverty rate, like the number of poor in Russian, have declined a little bit last year, and that's because a lot of people from poor regions have received a great payout from the state for going to the war, or the family receive when their close ones are dead. That's one of the reasons that explains the lack of the protest and a lot of social disagreement with this war, because actually so far war ends up being quite materially beneficial for many poor people in Russia.
I would just add one more comment that all of Ukraine is mobilized in a sense because there's an incredible network of civilian volunteers who are helping out. I've gone out with civilian volunteer groups They go in to rescue elderly people in villages under fire. They bring in food to those people. They bring in medicine. They bring in ambulances. They raise money and bring vests and used cars to the military because the military doesn't have enough armored vehicles. And most soldiers drive around in old Toyotas or cars that are brought in from used cars brought in from Europe, civilian cars. So there's an incredible mobilization on the Ukrainian side. There's also tens of thousands of civilian deaths, and the numbers really aren't known. For example, mass graves in Mariupol, we have no idea, really. The estimate's 20,000. It could be more just in Mariupol, and we may never know. Yes. New question.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that as the war has been going on and in the years running up to it, Russia has weaponized energy against the European continent and has done so in a significant way, both through infrastructure development, through resource cutoffs, through things like disinformation. On the disinformation front, I wanted to ask one question. There's been a lot of churn, pardon the pun, since September of this year, when the sabotage incidents took place on the Nord Stream 1 trunk lines 1 and 2 and the Nord Stream 2 second trunk line. And in the immediate aftermath, we saw, Russian troll and bot accounts pushing all sorts of different theories, the Ukrainians, the Poles, the Brits, et cetera. And in October, the Russian defense ministry came out and said unequivocally, according to available information, representatives of the unit of the British Navy took part in the planning, provision, and implementation of a terrorist attack on the Baltic Sea pipelines on September 26, blowing up Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 gas pipelines. And then, just a few months later, they also called a UN Security Council meeting just last week where they had hearings that included both other members and US academics. And the UN ambassador from Russia said, thanks to investigative journalists, they've determined not only that it was the United States that did it, but they also know now how they did it and their involvement with their NATO ally, Norway.
Have a lot of people like that.
Sorry, the question is, did the US do it?
Absolutely, 100%, unequivocally, no. And it is typical Russian disinformation to spread that. We always thought Nord Stream 2 was a terrible idea. The United States has said it's a terrible idea for decades. We didn't blow up infrastructure, in the waters of our partners and allies. Absolutely not. But I would say that the premise to your question about European dependence and, kind of what Russia has been using its energy weapon to do over the last decade plus is absolutely true. They're weaponizing energy right now in Ukraine. And this is a real wake-up call for all of us to continue to work hard to decrease our dependence on Russian fossil fuels. And I really think it is a silver lining of this terrible war is that Europe is getting serious about doing that.
Thank you.
I heard that exact line just last week in a track 2 just an unofficial meeting between in Turkey between Americans, Turks, and Russians. And exactly that came up. And it was an insinuation that disrupted a discussion where we were trying to ask about Ukraine. And then other things, and it falls in the category of whataboutisms and deflections and dissembling. We heard the usual Iraq, and then we heard the usual line on Kosovo, and then this is master. They're master diplomats in this range to turn and change the narrative.
I'm going to take a couple of questions because we're running out of time. So if we could have 3 people quickly ask their questions, and then I'm going to run through and you can take whichever one you want and answer it. So we'll start with you.
Hi, I was wondering if you could discuss the role that the Wagner Group is playing on the battlefield and also how that's Yevgeny Prigozhin is influencing Kremlin politics.
All right, that's clearly for Maria. Yes, sir.
I heard about $50 billion of money spent by the US and the call for more weapons and money support for Ukraine. So my question is the US at war against Russia through NATO? And if so, is really Ukraine democracy worthy of the World War III?
That's that's Robbins, and one more.
If Putin were to, how should I put it, fall out a window or drink some of that tea Alexei Navalny likes so much tomorrow, do you think that Russia would wind up suing for peace and ending the war, and why or why not?
Aha. All right. Well, Peter, we'll give you a start, and Maria may want to jump in. So first question for you.
And the last one, actually, because I work on Putinism.
Yes.
So Wagner Group, I think that's a little bit, the influence of the group is a little bit overestimated. The Russian regime relies on the set of quasi-formal, informal structures that sort of fill in where the institutional failures occur. And we've seen the rise of these political entrepreneurs in the 2014 conflict as well. You might remember the oligarch Malafeev. From my perspective, Prigozhin does not have any political capital, or by far is not strong enough to compete for any serious political role in the system, but he does fill in the niche, the void that emerged, especially when the failures of the Russian army on the ground have become apparent. Having said that, you see also that as the Russian army and the institutions sort of learn over the time, the influence of Prigozhin has been in decline, and that's exactly what is predicted based on these internal workings of the systems. To me, actors like Prigozhin, Kadyrov, they are corrections to this largely informal structure of the Russian political system, and I think they should be perceived as such without assigning to them too much political capital and independence of their own.
Right. So, and to Prigozhin, because we're running out of time, and I hope we'll have time for Putin. I'll come back. NATO, is NATO at war? Is the U.S. at war with Russia?
And I think, sir, the essence of your question was also, should the U.S. taxpayer be paying for this? Right. What's our national interest? And it's such an excellent question. And it's the right question for Americans to be asking. It's a lot of money. And I deeply believe that the support we're giving Ukraine is essential, because Ukraine is not just fighting for its freedom. It's fighting for the freedom and the principles that we have flourished under. After World War II, the United Nations, a group of nations that came together and put together a world order under which sovereignty and territorial integrity and independence all mattered. And bigger countries couldn't use their might to take over smaller countries. That's a world order that we have flourished under. And by the way, so is China. And China has also committed to that. And so I believe deeply, and I think Americans get this in their heart of hearts, that these principles do matter for our national security. In a sense, Ukraine is fighting for a war that matters for us, that matters for Europe. I believe every penny that we are spending in Ukraine is an investment in the future for our children. I really do. And if we're not getting that message out to Americans strongly enough, then we have to do a better job of it, we people in the government.
And lastly, I'm afraid we're out of time, so I'm going to ask each of you just to say yes or no. If Putin were pushed out the 16th floor window tomorrow, would this war come to an end? Yes or no, Maria?
That's not a yes or no question, I'm afraid. There's a possibility that the next personalistic rule of Russia will try to reset relationship with the US, with the West, because this war is Putin's war. He has a lot of stakes invested in it. Many of Russian elite members do not. Having said that, the problem with Russia will remain. Whoever is the next person who, even if that second person tries to reset the relationship, and we need to be thinking of the conditions, strings attached on Russia in the future, if ever a possibility of relaunching relationship with the West opens up again.
Great. And Peter, one sentence or two.
What I want to say is it depends, but I won't waffle out, and I will say, with some time, yes. Meaning maybe not the day after or the week or two after, but yes.
All right, well, we will drink to that possibility without anything in hand except water.
We got one more response, right?
Oh,
No, I think if Russia had a democratically elected leader, this war would end immediately. And so Putin started this war, he could stop this war.
and I don't think for that we should put our hopes too high. Maybe we'll put our hopes on it depends and hope that the right angle of it depends will work out at some point. And now I hand.
Well, I have a mic, but I want to just start by saying we should give our guests a round of applause. I promised you an extraordinary conversation. It's what you've gotten. And genuinely, you've got to know more leaving than when you came in, given what we've just heard. I want to thank you all again for carving out time to spend time with Perry Worldhouse. I want to thank Trudy for saving us at the last moment. She found out 20 minutes before this program was to start that our previous moderator was unwell and couldn't make it and did not hesitate to jump into the fray. And we are forever, obviously, in her debt. I want to let you all know, obviously, there's a grab and go, you know that. I want to let you know that obviously we're going on spring break from the 4th to the 11th, but right after that on the 14th of March, you're going to have a program in belated celebration of International Women's Day, which is actually March 8th, for those of you who don't know it, that's going to focus on women's rights and how women's rights are transforming various societies. This program will be online on YouTube in a day or so. You can also follow us on social media. You should sign up for our newsletter and you should definitely stay in touch. So thank you again. Enjoy the grab and go and have a good rest of your Tuesday. Thank you. And thank you to you.
You have time for one question? Yeah. I hope to talk again. It was great. And hope to talk to you more.